welcome to this explainer. When we learn about World War II, it's so often taught as this unstoppable collision of massive tectonic forces. But the core thesis of what we're looking at today changes that perspective entirely. World War II was not some inevitable clash. It wasn't just a force of nature sweeping across the globe. It was a catastrophe built brick by very specific, deliberate human choices made in the quiet of government offices and military headquarters.
It's a pretty haunting question to ask, isn't it? Could the deadliest conflict in human history actually have been stopped? I want you to kind of challenge your assumptions here for a minute. Picture history not as a single rushing river that you can't control, but as a series of falling dominoes. With every single decision made between 1931 and 1941, the options for peace grew narrower and narrower, until the world was basically backed into an inescapable corner.
Okay, let's dive into this. Instead of viewing history purely as these overarching tectonic forces, things like the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression setting a highly volatile stage, we need to look at the terrifying reality of human agency. It took 7 pivotal choices, 7 distinct, calculated decisions to ignite the globe. Let's trace how the world moved from a fragile peace to absolute devastation, starting with the very first domino.
Let's look at Decision 1. The Kwantung Army's strike.
We're starting back in 1931, over in Northeast Asia. The Empire of Japan is facing a severe economic crisis, and a radical military faction firmly believes their survival depends on territorial expansion. So on the night of September 18th, officers of the Japanese Kwantung Army just take matters into their own hands. They plant a rogue dynamite charge on a railway line near Mukden. It barely does any damage. Actually, a train passes right over it shortly after. But it gives them the perfect false flag pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, completely bypassing their own civilian government. But what makes this a truly global turning point is the diplomatic fallout. The League of Nations hesitates. They put out a report, sure, but they take no real action, and Japan simply walks away in 1933. This failure was watched very closely by Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who realized right then and there that the global order was nothing more than a paper tiger.
Which brings us to Decision 2, Hitler's Rhineland Gamble.
Fast forward to 1936. Adolf Hitler's absolute primary objective is systematically dismantling the Treaty of Versailles. And he starts by remilitarizing the Rhineland, which was a vital buffer zone meant to ensure French security. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the bluff here. Hitler sends a relatively tiny force of just 3,000 soldiers across the Rhine. They are vastly outnumbered by the French army. In fact, Hitler gives strict, secret orders to his generals. If the French mobilize, retreat immediately without firing a single shot. But the French and British are completely paralyzed by their own internal politics and economic distress. They do absolutely nothing. I really want to anchor you on this what if. Think about it. If the French had simply marched forward, Hitler would have suffered a humiliating defeat that could have collapsed his entire regime right then and there. Instead, the strategic balance of Europe fundamentally shifts in his favor.
Next up is Decision 3, the Munich Concession.
By 1938, Hitler's appetite is growing, and he sets his sights on the Sudetenland, a heavily fortified border region of Czechoslovakia. Now, Britain and France are desperately pursuing appeasement to avoid a war, and in doing so, they completely exclude Czechoslovakia from the negotiations about their own land. Returning to London after giving in to Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain waves a piece of paper and delivers this infamous quote, "I believe it is peace for our time." Wow, just let that tragic irony hang in the air for a moment.
Because literally just months later, in March 1939, that promise shatters entirely. Violating every single assurance he made at Munich, Hitler marches in and occupies the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This immediately proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that appeasement was a catastrophic failure. But it did something else deeply consequential. By freezing the Soviet Union out of those Munich talks, the Western Allies completely alienated Joseph Stalin. It convinced him he was being set up to face German aggression all by himself. And that sets the stage for Decision 4, the Unholy Alliance. Stalin's fear directly triggers one of the most stunning diplomatic maneuvers in history in August 1939, a non-aggression pact between ideological archenemies, Fascist Germany and the Communist Soviet Union. This perfectly illustrates the cold, calculated nature of the alliance. While the public sought peace treaty, hiding right underneath was a secret protocol. They literally carved a map of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Western Poland for Germany, Eastern Poland, the Baltics, Finland, and Bessarabia for the Soviets. For Hitler, this pact removed his ultimate nightmare of fighting a two-front war. And for Stalin? It bought him a massive buffer zone and the precious time he desperately needed to rebuild his purged army.
Moving on to Decision 5, crossing the Rubicon.
All right, it's September 1939. The diplomatic chessboard is set. The tension finally snaps. So the crucial point here is how terribly Hitler miscalculated this move. On August 31st, SS operatives staged the false flag Gleiwitz radio attack, actually using concentration camp prisoners as props to claim Polish aggression. The very next morning, September 1st, Germany invades Poland. Hitler is betting the whole shebang that Britain and France will back down yet again, exactly like they did with the Rhineland and Czechoslovakia. But the mood is shifted. Britain and France issue a strict ultimatum. Hitler ignores it.
And on the morning of September 3rd, a defeated Chamberlain sits before a microphone and delivers this broadcast to the Empire. Consequently, this country is at war with Germany. With those heavy words, Hitler's localized Eastern European conquest officially transforms into a major European war.
Now we jump to Decision 6, the War of Annihilation. Fast forward a bit to the summer of 1941. Germany has conquered much of Western Europe, but they are incredibly frustrated by the English Channel. Since he can't cross the water, Hitler makes the momentous strategic decision to turn his mighty war machine east. 3 million. That is the number of Axis soldiers that surged across the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. I really want you to absorb that number. It is a staggering, terrifying scale. We are talking about the largest single military invasion in the entire history of human warfare.
The consequences were simply apocalyptic. Stalin, despite getting numerous warnings, was completely taken by surprise. But here is exactly where Hitler's logic failed. The Red Army didn't collapse. Instead, the Soviet Union fully mobilized its immense population. By attacking before he had finished off Britain, Hitler actively created the exact two-front war he had spent years trying to avoid. The Eastern Front devolved into a total, consuming war of annihilation, and it became Hitler's ultimate nightmare.
Which brings us to our final domino. Decision 7, the global conflagration.
Late 1941, an increasingly aggressive Japan has been cornered by a devastating U.S. oil embargo, threatening to completely freeze their economy. Starved for resources and faced with total collapse, Japan strikes. The escalation here is frighteningly rapid. On December 7th, they launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The very next day, December 8th, the United States formally enters the Pacific War against Japan. But I want you to notice what happens just a few days later, on December 11th.
Hitler voluntarily declares war on the United States. And the crazy thing? He was under zero legal obligation to do this. The Tripartite Pact only required defense if an ally was attacked, and Japan was the clear aggressor here. Historians widely consider this to be Hitler's most baffling and catastrophic error. By doing this, he instantly merged these distinct regional wars into one single global world war. It allowed President Roosevelt to fully back a Germany-first strategy, bringing the immense industrial might of America crashing straight down on Europe.
So let's wrap this up with our conclusion: the architecture of catastrophe. Let's move to and see how this builds, pulling back to look at the big picture and returning to our core thesis of human agency. Look at how this architecture of catastrophe stacks up. From the rogue invasion of Manchuria shattering global credibility to the Rhineland gamble shifting military power. From the utter failure of appeasement in Munich to the cold partitioning of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Then, the miscalculated invasion of Poland, the literally suicidal scale of Operation Barbarossa, and finally, Pearl Harbor and Hitler's baffling declaration that merged it all together. 7 specific choices that systematically, piece by piece, dismantled horrible peace.
Please like and subscribe.